Well, hello again, and welcome back to the next episode of the Rings of Power Impressions Recapped. This time it's episode 6, Udûn. So, wow, that was quite the episode. I have to say, there's only a huge amount to say about the storylines, particularly, because there was two, and then they merged together. And of course, we saw nothing from the elves, dwarves, or Harfoots this time around, nor any more politicking back on Numenor. So this will probably be a fairly brief recap, because the meat of this episode, of course, was the battle sequences, which were, I have to say, very good. And I'll get a bit more into my thoughts on those slightly later on. But first of all, I want to start with the ending, because I have to say, I'm intrigued with the idea they've gone for with the Rings of Power here. My original concern was that they would either stick too closely to the books, which they couldn't really adapt, and so you'd end up with problems there, or they would go completely beyond the realms of the books themselves and just sort of do a vaguely Lord of the Rings inspired fantasy series. But what they seem to have done here is, in addition to trying to adapt parts of the appendices, they've sort of given themselves license to showcase the emergence or the creation of various important backstory aspects of Lord of the Rings. And I mean, it works, which I'm almost quite surprised about. I didn't necessarily think that this would work if they were. I had thought they might do more along this idea when the Mithril origin was shown to us, but they've really gone in for it here with showing what appears to be the origins of Mordor, which again I think is quite interesting. Certainly nothing like what is depicted here ever happens in the Silmarillion. We just sort of know that Sauron makes his home in Mordor, and obviously over time that's corrupted. I'm also reminded of another piece of sort of expanded universe, I guess, to use the term, Lord of the Rings lore from the Shadow of Mordor game, which also uses the idea of not the creation of Mordor, but the re-inhabitation of Mordor by Sauron as a major plot point. But to come back to the original episode, yes, I think overall I like it. I wasn't sure I would towards the end. I sort of was wondering where it was going with the sword and Adar and what his plan overall was. I have to say, I do still think that the idea of dropping a lot of water into presumably Mount Doom to make it erupt, Orodruin and the Fire Mountain, I'm not sure that's quite what I would have gone with if I was the screenwriter. But, as a plan, as a mechanism to get to where the story needs to go with the creation of Mordor, it's not terrible. And yes, the overall feel of the episode, the overall direction of it, and the ending I thought was well done, also because I was slightly concerned it was going to be too much like the Battle at Helm's Deep. It was already quite like the Battle of Helm's Deep, but having it end actually on a down note saves it from just feeling like a clone of that. And I think actually makes it quite interesting, because that's unusual in the Lord of the Rings films, or indeed the book as well. Battles in Lord of the Rings don't tend to end in failure for the heroes. They tend to end in successes. Even if those successes are temporary or aren't ultimately that important, they are still successes. So having it end on kind of a down note was unusual. It was more something you'd expect from Game of Thrones, and I quite like that. So anyway, that's enough about the ending. Obviously, I'll get more specifics of that at some point. But for now, I want to talk a bit about the actual episode itself, and particularly the way that the action was shot. Because I have to say, I think this was really good. Yes, it wasn't on par with Lord of the Rings films, because again, it still doesn't have quite that budget. But I did really think that the way that the fight sequences in the village were shot, and the pacing overall of the fight was very good. I did have some issues with the pacing overall, but that was really only when they began obviously cutting back to the Númenóreans to try and set up the obvious cavalry charge at the end. And the cavalry charge at the end being that obvious, in my opinion, was a bit unfortunate. But in terms of the actual pacing of the fight scene in the village itself, it was very good. Starting off with the bait and switch over the tower, done very well. Then the reverse bait and switch, when it turns out that it was all the villagers who were fighting the other villagers, very good. It also kind of explained away my issue of, why is a bunch of barely armed peasants able to fight off orcs? And it's like, well, they weren't. They were just fighting other humans, other human peasants. So yeah, that was excellent. I also thought, and I don't think I'm the only person to have thought this, that fight sequence between Arondir and the big burly orc towards the beginning of the episode very much reminded me of the fight sequence in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark between Indiana and the German mechanic when they have that boxing match with the plane. And eventually the guy gets hit with the propeller. That really reminded me of that, and that had that sort of vibe of just giving the actors or the stunt doubles, I'm not sure, the chance to just have a good old-fashioned fight sequence that felt very meaty and engaging. So that was brilliant. The ending, I have to say, I was a little underwhelmed with the actual shooting of the charge sequence at the end with the village. Again, I recognise that it's not really fair to compare it to Helm's Deep or the Battle of the Plenel Fields. They still don't have that kind of budget or that kind of scope. But it did feel a little... The problem is that if you have that as your ending, people are going to make that comparison. And because it's not as good, it's going to feel underwhelming, even when actually it's still pretty good. So yes, I'm also not... I mentioned in the previous episode that I quite liked the Númenórean armour. Not so much now. It worked well in Númenor with that kind of colour background, but in Middle-earth it almost seems a bit silly to have all this white armour. It doesn't look as good as it did when we saw it at the end of the last episode in Númenor. Aside from that, I guess the only other thing to say was that the extras and the overall choreography of the battle sequences were very good. I also think that whether it's Galadriel or her stunt double does a very good job on horseback. And overall, again, I was impressed. It's not the best battle sequence I've seen, even televised. That still probably goes to the battle at the end of season 2 in Game of Thrones. I forget precisely what the battle's called now, but it will come to me. The Battle of the Blackwater. That's it. The Battle of the Blackwater. Anyway, moving on to the character work. I thought, again, very good for the most part. The dialogue remains a little clunky, and they do have a tendency of, I think at this point, relying too heavily on references to specific famous moments from the books and films, including the dialogue. They reference the idea of the shadow as a passing thing. It is only a passing thing, this shadow, which is a very famous line from Sam. The idea that it is only a passing thing, this shadow, and when the sun shines, it will shine out the clearer, which is a great line and one of my personal favourite quotes from The Lord of the Rings. But that, again, I don't have a problem with them directly referencing occasionally, but it does feel like they're doing it more often now. And it feels like maybe they aren't quite comfortable with their own writing. And while I empathise, given that they're trying to give the feel of one of the 20th century's greatest writers in the English language, constantly referring back to his own work makes you feel a bit insecure. And there was another example of that, which is the Master of the Secret Fire, which of course is a reference to Eru, the Eru Eluvata. But it's also the line spoken by Gandalf on the bridge. I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udûn. And of course, Udûn being the name of the episode and also the name of the valley in Mordor, which was a clever hint, which I didn't have to say I didn't get, that this was going to happen, that we would see the creation of Mordor in this episode. So, that aside, the writing remains decent, the dialogue remains good, if not great, and the action sequences overall were pretty good. So to quickly round off, the other thing I want to talk briefly about is the depiction of orcs. And I've mentioned this before in the previous episodes, that Rings of Power seems to be trying to give the orcs more personality, more of a culture, and a history than other adaptations of The Lord of the Rings have done. And I quite like that, not least because, as far as I'm aware, and I have to say that I don't know so much about this, that towards the end of his life, Tolkien himself became concerned with the issue of having a sort of, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, a chaotic evil, an always evil race of beings in his universe, particularly given that, as is mentioned in the episode by Adar, that all of the creatures ultimately on Middle-earth are the creation of the Eru, who is the god figure. And if the Eru is good, then how can things be created in his world that are against his idea of the plan? And so Tolkien himself seems to have taken this on. And I read once that around the time of his death, he was actually beginning to rewrite some of his earlier works to try and change how the orcs fit into it. But I don't think he ever really got around to doing that. So I find that interesting that they're actually bringing up that philosophical issue within the Rings of Power, the idea of the orcs being always evil, being an evil faction, but actually playing around with it a bit and giving us the idea that, well, maybe they have their own perspective, maybe they aren't just mindless killers, and that they do actually have their own culture, their own values, their own history. I will say also that having Adar be kind of one of the first Uruks does nicely square the circle, because it's very clear in Tolkien's work that no elf ever fell to Sauron, i.e. no elf ever willingly became a servant of Sauron, or indeed Morgoth, more importantly. Although Morgoth claimed to have turned Feanor, he never actually did. Feanor's failings and ultimate downfall were caused by his own pride and arrogance, not by Morgoth's corruption of him to Morgoth's side. So, having him be a first-generation Uruk, or Orc, nicely squares that circle. You don't need to have him be an elf who turned to evil. He was made that way by Morgoth, as we do know that there are different stories as to how the Orcs were created, but one of them is that they were corrupted elves, so that works within the canon. Aside from that, I guess the only last thing is to talk about my least favourite aspect of this whole storyline, which is the romance between Bronwyn and Arondir. I still don't like it. I think they should have just made them allies, friends. I don't think it would have affected the storyline at all. Frankly, I honestly think it would have been better. I do at least like the fact that they bothered to switch the genders around, because in Tolkien's work it's, I think, always a male human and a female elf, whereas here it's a male elf and a female human. That's something at least. But again, honestly, they could have cut that, and I don't think it would have made a difference. So, closing thoughts. I guess there's just a couple of little things I wanted to mention. I like that the collapse of the tower feels like not just a repudiation of the orcs, but also in a way a repudiation of the tension between the elves and the humans. We know from very early on in the series that there's major tension between elves and humans, and that the tower has become a symbol of kind of elven mastery that is hated by a lot of the men of the Southlands, and not just those who are pro-Sauron. So seeing it come down was quite nice in that respect. It was both a repudiation of Sauron, but also of kind of elven rule over the Southlands, particularly since Halbrand has come back, although, of course, now things will be a lot more complicated now that Mordor is seemingly being created. Also, Galadriel's conversation with Adar was interesting. Obviously, they're leaning more and more into her potentially being a villain. Not being a villain, that's too far. Having villain-like qualities, and obviously the way the episode ends with her simply allowing the ash and gas to consume her, hints that we're going to have some major character work with Galadriel next episode. And finally, I liked that they ended. Obviously, it didn't end on this because we had the eruption afterwards, but the battle, after the battle, you had the little feast with the villagers and the Númenóreans, which is very sort of Tolkien-esque. It reminded me a little of the feast at the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, which I think was intentional and also good. It shows that, again, I think that and the music, it shows that the writers have a grasp on the kind of things that Tolkien, from a aesthetic perspective, from a kind of broader tone perspective, like to do and like to have in his works, even if they haven't quite got the authorial voice or the dialogue writing down. I think they know the kind of things that Tolkien would have written about and written into his stories. You know, food, parties, friends, music. These all appear in a lot, in quantity in the Rings of Power, and that I think is something that Tolkien would have appreciated. So yes, I think that's pretty much it. Yes, one last point. I did think it was a bit silly that nobody checked the bundle. I noticed that the bundle with the axe in it at the end did not look like the same bundle as the one that was taken by Adar. I assumed that maybe it wasn't, as in it didn't contain the sword. But the idea that nobody checked that until Theo did is a little silly. I'll let it go because it needed to happen, but I did think that was a bit silly. But yeah, so I guess now we'll find out whether or not the tower will become Barad-dûr. Or indeed that really is Mount Doom. But anyway, so this has been a bit of a shorter recap because not too much to say, given that it was one big long story this time. But yes, I will see you guys next time for episode 7, and we're getting close to the end now. So goodness me, it's going to be very interesting to see how this all ends. So please remember to like and subscribe. And I will see you guys next time. Okay, bye.